when we listen to people, we can hear really clearly that those things, that those injustices are true, that those inequalities do exist. I think that sometimes there's an anxiety about seeing, admitting and engaging with those, because it means confronting our own privileges. And I think it's really important that when we're doing the work of allyship, or when we're working in coalition, we're not thinking that we're losing something, we're thinking that we're gaining something, right? It's not that someone's trying to take your hard time away from you. It's that we don't need to be competitive about who's having a hard time. What we need to do is confront what injustices are happening and how we can rectify them.
Hi there. For this episode of Different Conversations, I wanted to do something a little bit different. Here in the UK, it's Black History Month. And so I'm passing the podcast this month over to two friends of mine, two fantastic colleagues, and two just truly amazing people. Kate M. Graham, Senior Lecturer in Literature, and Stephen Bunbury from the School of Law, also Senior Lecturer in Law. This conversation is just fantastic. I really enjoyed recording it. I hope you enjoy listening in. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Hi, I'm Stephen Bunbury. I'm a senior lecturer in a law school. I lead on EDI in a law school, and also I lead on academic integrity in a law school. I'm pleased to be here today to interview Kate about something that is close to my heart, Black History Year or Black History Month. And yeah, that's a bit about me. I also sit on the BME network, and I'm part of the committee. So I'm the research officer, which we deal with learning and research on the committee. I'm also part of a Black History Year steering group as well.
Hey, I'm Kate M. Graham. I'm a lecturer in English literature based in the School of Humanities, and I'm the School of Humanities EDI lead. So I do the same job as Stephen. And I also sit on the Black History Year steering committee, and I'm part of the Decolonising the Curriculum Toolkit steering committee too. And it's a pleasure to be here chatting about being an ally. Okay,
so Kate, great to see you here again. We've also talk about this type of stuff in our EDI Leads meeting, and it's great to have you here and to talk about being an ally. Just really, first of all, just a question for you that could develop into something else. Being an ally, some people get confused with it. I even get confused with when we talk about allies, and when someone said, you know, trying to recruit allies, I used to be a bit confused about what it means. What does it mean? So what does it mean to you being an ally, and have it been interpreted differently? Have you experienced that being interpreted differently to different colleagues or friends? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's such a big question, but such a sort of important one. And I think one of the really nice things I felt in like getting ready for a conversation today was like really thinking about the value of interrogating what I think being an ally is and what I think I'm doing when I do the work of being an ally. And I think for me, really centrally, I understand the society that we live in as being like deeply unequal and as being structurally racist. And I want to take part in changing that. I want to be active in confronting things, social issues, social injustices, and I want to play a part in the small ways that I can in making social change. I think that's a really important thing to do, to sort of step up and make a difference. So I think one of the things then that's central for me in being an ally is action and like doing stuff and taking part, not sort of sitting back and watching, but like really being actively involved. So I think that's.
Yeah, I like your point about structurally racist and also society being unequal. Can you just expand on what you mean by, you know, unequal? Because unequal to someone could mean sex, gender, it could mean sexuality, it could mean race. What do you mean by unequal?
Yeah, so good question. I think that we live in a society in which there are a number of different sort of inequalities, like all of the axes, along all of the axes that you've just pointed out, right? And I think that we need to make sure that we keep all of those in view at any one time, and we need to make sure we're sort of thinking intersectionally about those sort of injustices and those inequalities. Because if we don't sort of keep them in view, if we don't confront them, if we don't flatten them out, then we can have conversations about them. And I think those conversations start to facilitate change, right?
But sorry, Kate, continue.
Well, I was going to say, I think that one of the things I think we often see is we see this sort of model of like the centre and the margin. And then we see people brought in from the margins in towards the centre. And I think one of the things that's important for me doing ally work is trying to think about ways of actually just deconstructing that whole model. Because all that means is you bring someone in from the margin to the centre, and then someone else occupies that marginalised position, right? How can we literally change that structure of thinking?
Yeah, that's interesting. And you talk about structure loosely. What do you mean by structure and structurally racist? That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, so for me, I guess what that means is all of the ways in which the social structures that we've built, so whether we're thinking education, whether we're thinking in terms of police and the law, whether we're thinking like geographically in terms of how we organise our like social spaces or geographical spaces, architectural spaces, that I think that across all of those, what we see is that white people move through them with greater ease. They're structured so that white people sort of can succeed, and they're structured in ways that like disadvantage people from BME backgrounds, so Black people, British people, etc.
Interesting, yeah, and that's an interesting one for me because sometimes, you know, it's not obvious when we talk about structural inequalities, especially when it comes to race. Do you think it's easy to identify? So someone, a white person to you might say, well, you know, I had my own struggles. I had to go through the hoops. So I don't see anything different to Black, you know, if you're Black or Asian. Do you think it's obvious that there are structural inequalities? And when people have that reaction, what's your view?
For me, yes, those structural inequalities are really obvious. And when we listen to Black people, when we listen to Black people's experiences and stories and analyses of you know, the structures that we exist in, and particularly sort of like, I guess, education, because we both work in education, so these are often the conversations we're part of. When we listen to people, we can hear really clearly that those things, that those injustices are true, that those inequalities do exist. I think that sometimes there's an anxiety about seeing, admitting and engaging with those because it means confronting our own privileges. And I think it's really important that when we're doing the work of allyship or when we're working in coalition, we're not thinking that we're losing something, we're thinking that we're gaining something, right? It's not that someone's trying to take your hard time away from you. It's that we don't need to be competitive about who's having a hard time. What we need to do is confront what injustices are happening and how we can rectify them, and that those conversations can take place.
That's interesting, you know, because, you know, having spoken to some of my white friends and you know, sometimes they don't always see it as obvious. And even me as a Black person, sometimes I go through systems and I don't see it or feel it at that time, but actually when I reflect on it, I start thinking, well, maybe there are some structural inequalities, but I put it behind my head. For white people that don't feel that it's an issue or not so obviously structural inequalities, what would you say to them being a white person?
I think listen, right? I think that just like listening and engaging is absolutely central, because I think often there's a one of the things I think we can see is a sort of distrust, like, well, I don't see it like that, or I didn't experience it like that. And it's like, I think we have to question, why would you see it? You're not, your experience and your position is specific and not omnipotent, right? So if we're listening to someone who is articulately telling us about an injustice that they have faced, we need to listen and accept what they're telling us rather than dismiss it. And I think that so often we see this kind of dismissal, this like, I didn't see it, it didn't happen. It's like, of course you didn't see it. Why would you see it? The assumption that you would see it, I think, is always one of privilege, right? It comes from a place of privilege. So
yeah. Yeah, it's very refreshing talking to you because you're so confident talking about it not being a Black person. And I think that's something that we need to take note of, because you're very confident talking about it, because I can be talking to even a white friend or someone else that's white and they feel very uncomfortable and defensive. what makes you confident talking about this Black history, not being a Black person? What makes you confident and so passionate about this?
I mean, as I said before, like I do really, I really care about social injustice, and I really care about confronting these issues. I also, I think one of the things that helps me to have this sort of confidence in talking about, I think there are several things. One of them is that I'm a queer woman with ADHD, and so my passage through the world is fraught. And I've been in numerous situations where I've tried to describe my difficulties in moving through certain kinds of institutions or certain kinds of structures, and people go, no. Particularly around ADHD, actually, you sort of say, well, these are the difficulties I have, and people will say, well, everyone feels like that, and you're like, no, it's really specific, and it's because of a brain chemistry thing, right? And so I've experienced that kind of erasure before. I've experienced that sort of disbelief. I've experienced that lack of listening. And for me, it's really central that not only I refuse it when it happens to me, but also I then don't do it to other people. So I can't, it's really important that I'm not then complicit in marginalizing other marginalized people. And I think for me to be able to do this work, like I've done a lot of reading, I've done a lot of research, and I think that's given me a kind of confidence, like listening and engaging for me gives, again, I'm an educator, so of course I say that, right? But like, but that gives me confidence. And I think, and again, I see this with my students, that when I can introduce them to this kind of material, when I can talk to them about critical race theory, when I can talk to them about queer theory, when I can bring them into contact with these kinds of stories and narratives and politics, seeing how excited and empowered and like seen they are with that material is so powerful that you just, and I know you know this from your own teaching experience, right? But like I want to do that in all the spaces that I'm in. That feels really important to moving and going.
Good. Yeah. Very interesting. And so you say you identify yourself as queer and ADHD, and that's interesting in itself, in that we're dealing with Black history. Do you see the same issues, or do you experience the same issues that that Black people experience being labelled as, or your identity as queer, and ADHD, obviously ADHD being a disability, and labeling yourself as queer being sexuality? Are the experiences the same as experiences for Black people, or the issues?
I think that's a really good and a really important question. Like for me, what I don't want to do and what I want to be really conscious about is like not creating false equivalence, because my lived experience is not, my lived embodied experience as a queer person with ADHD is not the same as the embodied lived experience of a Black person. Like it's not. But I do understand what it's like to be marginalized, what it's like to have that friction when you're moving through particular kinds of structures like that. I understand the specificity and embodiedness of it. I can't understand. All I can do is listen, right? And sort of and try to be empathetic in the way that I listen. So not the same, but I also think there's such an important thing in terms of creating alliances across marginalized positions, because we need to do that while not erasing each other's experiences, but we experience the same kind of marginalization, the same kind of relations to structure, the same sort of movement through communities, sort of societies and communities. And I think that there's a power to that should be used to create like important alliances.
Excellent. Yeah, very, very interesting. And I like your passion for, bringing it in your teaching, and I can see from your voice that it empowers you. And these are the things you want to bring into a teaching and should be brought into a teaching. And this is hopefully what we are doing, or trying to incorporate in our respective schools, in relation to decolonizing the curriculum, which is another discussion to have for another podcast, but absolutely. So empowerment is one for me. How would you empower your colleagues in your school or colleagues in the university or even friends to become an ally if they're not an ally? So what would you do, or what would your reaction be if someone said, I really want to help, but actually I really don't know? You're just confident, you have your own you have your own experiences of things, but I don't have those experiences. What would your reaction be?
I think one of the really important things to think when we're thinking about how we do the work of being an ally working in coalition is to acknowledge that, like, we might get things wrong, and that we might make mistakes, and that we might occupy spaces in ways that aren't entirely appropriate, and that's okay as long as we learn from it and sort of rectify it. Because I think one of the things we see really clearly, I see it in my social circles, I see it in amongst colleagues, is this fear of getting it wrong, of like saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And I think that fear then stops people from doing the work. And I think that if you do the research and if you do the listening, then you've got the knowledge, right? Because it's about a set of sort of critical thinking skills which we can learn, which we can all learn, again, through doing the reading, through doing the listening. And I think because I think often what I find people want, I don't know if you find this as EDI leads, but people often want a sort of how-to guide, like, if I tick these boxes, then I'm not going to be a racist. And it's like,
lawyers love that. Lawyers love that. They love a tick box, or have I fulfilled this and I need to tick this off and make sure I'm not being, yeah.
And you're like, I don't think that's not how it's going to work. We can't do it like that, because if you're ticking a box, you're not thinking. It's just and also
I think it doesn't stop at work, it stops outside. So I suppose my next question to you is that, is it just work that you're ticking boxing and then you come out of work and you're potentially a racist or you don't adhere to those principles and it's a different you? But where does this stop? What's your view on that?
For me, it keeps going, and it permeates everything, because once you're not ticking boxes, once you're doing the thinking, then it's everywhere. And actually then it's much easier because you've equipped yourself with a set of skills that help you navigate through whatever kind of bit of your life you're in, right? Because you can have the conversations, you can do the work, you can do the confronting when you hear something that's not okay, because you've got the skills, you're not just ticking the boxes. So I think that, again, the listening, the reading, they can change how you think, and they can change how you move through spaces, and they can take away that fear. And I think also, it's really important that, like, sometimes you'll make mistakes, sometimes you'll say the wrong thing or you'll do the wrong thing. Like, I know that in the future I will make mistakes, and the important thing is what I do in response to them. Like, that I hold space for them, and I held my hands up and I acknowledge that I've stepped wrong. But then how do I actively go and learn from it? How do I make a change? Like, why did that mistake happen? And what can you do to change it? Because that work, doing that, for me, that's really working in coalition. That's really being a good ally.
And this brings me nice onto my next question. So, talking about empowerment, and it's not so much a question, it's your views. Do you think not being Black, people can be an effective ally? So some people, again, and this comes back to something else I was saying earlier. So they say to you, well, or say to me, well, I'm not Black, I don't know about lived experience, I can't really contribute anything, I cannot bring anything to the table. But actually, you're teaching our students that are Black, or and they're getting taught by you, which the university is going through this whole decolonization, and EDIs are one of our main focuses. What would you say? What would your advice be generally if you was having a chat with a colleague about that, or anyone?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can contribute. You can contribute by, you can contribute by listening. That in and of itself is a contribution. And when you're reading, when you're engaging with stories and politics and narratives, etc., you are contributing. But also, like, with my work on Black History Year, which is an absolute highlight of my working life, right? I contribute by being present and by taking part and by coming up with event ideas and by liaising with speakers, by producing content for the blog and by promoting stuff on social media, by advertising it to the students. And I can be present and offer that kind of support. And I think just being present has a value, right? Because I'm just by being present, I'm showing, I hope that I'm showing that I care, that I'm invested, that I want to make change.
Or you're present here now talking to me and giving up your time. Otherwise, so that just goes to show you that's powerful in itself, coming from a Black person. And it's refreshing, really, because sometimes people are quite apprehensive about having these open conversations. And actually, this is powerful for me. Just doing this interview is powerful for me. Saying that, you know, someone that is not Black actually cares or wants to be an ally, or is just as passionate and probably can sometimes know more than me about Black history, because I put my hands up. I don't know everything about Black history. And some of the things I'm learning as because it's been brought to the table, it's more obvious, we're doing events, and I'm still learning as a Black person. And I can learn from people that are not Black. So yeah, absolutely.
I'm really glad it feels like that. That's really powerful for me to hear. And I think that thing you just said about learning, I think is really important, because every time I go into a Black History Year space, I'm learning. Every time we do an event, I'm learning stuff. So you know, that's another way of sort of contributing. And just the things you learn are powerful, right? The things you learn change how you move through the world. And just I'm really, you know, honored to take part in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're passionate. I've had conversations with you before about privileged spaces, and that's a concept that I don't really understand. What is that? What are you talking about when you're talking about privileged spaces?
Yeah, so this is one of my things I feel very passionately about, privileged spaces and hierarchical spaces, because I think this is really true of education in particular, that so often in universities, the people who are able to speak in the spaces that we are in are often not the people, are often people from sort of central positions, from, you know, the sort of the white cis people, right, who are able to speak. And I think for marginalized people, it can be really difficult to feel like you have a right to be in those spaces, a right to speak in those spaces, and also like a right to be, the phrase, I don't know if this is the right, but to be emotional in those spaces. Because I think sometimes, and this I think is often true of the EDI conversations, that, you know, that the people who are doing that work care deeply about it. And so when we talk about it, we can talk about it in really passionate ways. And sometimes it can feel like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't have been so, you know, emotional about it, or I shouldn't have been so angry, or, you know, whatever the sort of loaded emotional term is, right? And I think that it's that we need to try and disrupt that as much as we can. That we need to change the tone of those spaces, what's permissible in those spaces, and to change the kind of behavioral codes in those spaces, right? Because those behavioral codes are designed to exclude people from the conversation, and that's wrong.
Or make you feel that you shouldn't be talking about this stuff. Oh, it's Stephen having a moment because he's Black. It's the old, you know, the whole race card. You know, that's what I used to have back in the day. He's playing the race card, and that's a mechanism. And you make an important point. That's a mechanism to keep your mouth shut. And actually, you shouldn't be talking about it. But really and truly, this is the reason why we have these issues, is because we're not talking about it and we're not putting it on the table. And so you make a valid point, and I like that explanation. So I understand it much more now. It's been, you know, great listening to what you've been telling me. So, you know, it's empowering me to speak to more people about being an ally, and especially those people that are not white, to be honest. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Kate, is any advice you'd give to a white person that is apprehensive about being an ally? So I often, or sometimes I have conversations with people, and sometimes I don't say it, but the opinion I get was, oh, I keep out of that because it's not my territory. You know, I'm sort of scared to say the wrong thing. Or what would you say about an advice about someone being apprehensive?
I think, first of all, in some ways it's good to be apprehensive because it means you want to take care, but don't let the apprehension stop you. Just think about how you can move forward, but take care in the way that you move forward. And so for me, what was really important was different kinds of reading and research. So firstly, the sort of big, understanding the bigger histories, understanding the sort of broader concepts. So I mean, like, what do we mean when we're talking about race? What is the sort of history of race? And then for me, what was really important was thinking about, like, I can't make massive change, but what I can do is make small changes in the areas and spaces that I'm in. So then what it was important for me to do was to like focus my research on the areas I was in. So I do a lot of work with queer theory, and queer theory has a really difficult relationship with race and has often sort of excluded Black scholars and scholars of colour. And so what I did was I thought about all of the Black scholars who'd written critiques of queer theory, from an embodied position, and I engaged with that material and different kinds of material. So I read theoretical stuff, but I also read oral histories, just because then I was getting different kinds of opinions and kinds of informations. And then, I'm a literature scholar, so I read novels, right? Because reading stories is, I'm a literature scholar, so I think stories can change the world.
Yeah.
But like, that's really powerful, because again, then you're experiencing things in a very full way. And for some people, like, theory works, politics works. For others, stories and narratives are really important. For me, going to the theatre is really important. Like, sitting, watching something happen, watching these debates play out in front of me, for me is just a really valuable way of learning. So think about how you learn, think about what spaces that you're in, and then think about how you can read, listen, and engage in ways that will help you make changes in the spaces that you're in. Because I think sometimes we can feel like the world is too big for us to make a difference in, or culture is too big for us to make an engagement in it or make a difference. But actually, like, we all make culture by going about our individual lives. So if we make small differences in our individual lives, we can make bigger changes, bigger cultural changes. One of the things that's implicit in this idea of listening that we've both talked about is that it's just like holding space for people. And I think that's what we've done here today, and that's a really powerful thing. So thank you.
And thank you, Kate, for giving up the time, and thank you for being so passionate. And I know you're passionate anyway. You've come and spoken about EDI at our school, and it's great. It's absolutely great. And being on the steering group, Black History Year, and having you there is great and powerful for me. Even personally, and yeah, it's great. Thank you.
I'm glad. It's a powerful space. It's a really powerful space.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed today's podcast, feel free to subscribe, whether you're watching us on YouTube or if you're listening to the audio version, whichever audio service you found us on. You can find us on iTunes, Anchor, Spotify, or all the usual suspects. My name's Brad Elliott, and this has been today's Different Conversation.